Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. There's no intro music because this is my first time using StreamYard, and I think you have to pay for that. So what are you going to do? Welcome to the Chapter 4, or Secular Literary Circle's fourth video, which is also Chapter 4 of Bart Ehrman's book, Heaven and Hell, A Brief History of the Afterlife, here with Ali Kai as well as usual. Thanks so much. Again, we are on Divine Disbelief, the channel here. We decided to come over here because you know what? It's always great to go back and forth between things, see who can host, and what kind of type of audience we could get for channels and stuff like that.
Well, and we had been planning to do this anyhow before, I ended up severing my working relationship with Nakasuchi. So, which for those of you who don't know, Nak and I had some creative differences. I'm no longer working for his channel, so my collaboration here plus the solo channel I'll be launching pretty soon is going to be the bulk of my work.
So there you go, and we are excited to see what you're going to be doing with that. I have seen already some of the ideas you've had, and am just love that stuff. So welcome in, comrade, What the Craft. I don't know how to say celery. Not funny. Callan, Geo Sam, Lisa, Tapioca Weasel as well. Really want to read some of Ehrman's book. It says Tapioca Weasel. Well, good news. You can get it from the publisher, Simon & Schuster. And we have a link in the description for you to go and grab that. And you certainly should do that today. We're on Chapter 4. And by the way, Susan, a little under the weather today. She's not joining us. She still is in the chat, though. So very, very excited to have that. We've had, it's not always it's not a bad thing, right? We come in and sometimes just two of us, sometimes three of us. It's nice to have a lot of different, I think.
Well, she deserves some time off after working her butt off on that video that you guys did. You guys did some really great work. I did a blast on Twitter for it because I was so impressed. Great job.
Certainly appreciate that. The video she's talking about, if you don't know, is our most recent video. It was actually our first premiere, and it is it's called Errors in, quote, Errors. It's Errors in Biblical Contradictions or something. Number 1, I forget what it is. It's inspiring us. Video. We made a response, the first of what I think is 4. She thinks is 3. I don't know. Response videos to his video about the Luke census. So certainly, if you have the opportunity, go and see or go and watch that. It's got some really great reviews from folks. Somebody said it's the most well-researched video that they've seen on the topic. So appreciate that. And yes, Susan did such an amazing job with the graphics there and everything. So, but we're going to get in here. If you would like to check out the previous videos and get clear, we are going to be posting on our channel probably, and my screen went out for a second. Probably tonight. And then you'll be able to watch those as well. And you can kind of skip ahead of things like this, obviously, if you're not watching the live stream. So today's
Tapioca Weasel, that was not on your end. Nathaniel was having some technical difficulties. You cut out pretty bad. You might want to repeat what you just said because you were skipping.
Son of a gun. What happened? The lag and the internet. I imagine.
Okay, I'll get out of the stream.
I imagine that it's there's also the internet from the roommates like to use it and stuff too, which that's going to happen. So, but today's it starts on page 2 of the book. If you have it, it's chapter 4, and it is titled "Will Justice Be Done? The Rise of Postmortem Rewards and Punishments." And this is very exciting because it kind of shows overall how, if you've been keeping up with us so far, that this idea of divine punishment or divine reward has been very kind of vague. There's the idea of, like in some of the Greek stuff we went over, where it's just like the gray soul type stuff. And then moving on from that, it was getting into where there's like this meadow they all live in, and stuff like that. And now this really gets into, today we're going to be talking about Plato. So if you're a fan of that work, please feel free to educate me, because for all the things that I do with the New Testament of the Bible, Plato is not in the New Testament. So learning that.
I mean, like, the early Catholic Church seems to think that he was in the New Testament, but we'll get into that later. I have a lot of things to say about Platonism and where Christianity seems to have decided that Plato was not a polytheist and that he just wanted to be, like, he just was appeasing the government or something, that he was actually a monotheist, and so was Iamblichus, but, like, we'll get into that at some point.
Yep, that's going to be, I think that's actually a little bit of things that are mentioned later on in the book as well. Clearing up, and Dr. Ehrman does a great job of clearing up a lot of these misconceptions as well. And I appreciate him for that, because as always, he is in my opinion, when it comes to scholars, he is a phenomenal communicator. And especially when writing some of this prose at the beginning of these chapters and the sub-chapters. And at this one, starts off by saying there were obvious problems with the concept of Hades imagined in the writings of Homer. If everyone had the same fate after death, whether noble or lowly, righteous or wicked, valiant or cowardly, then where is justice? Doesn't this life end? Doesn't this life in the end make any sense? Such a fabulous way to start that, right? Talks about, what about if people do things that, and then they die before they're punished, or we don't find out about it? What happened? These are the great questions, right, of philosophy as well, and of these theological ideas. And he starts it off really well.
Well, and this is also a reminder that, like, both Virgil and Plato lived during times of great strife within the Greek community. There were wars going on. There was lots of corruption within the government. Like, this was a period in Greece where people really longed for that sort of divine punishment or divine reward, because life was really freaking hard back then. You know, like, he goes into that a little bit with his last stuff on Virgil last week, which we covered a little bit. But with Plato, like, Plato was very, very concerned with creating a just society. His Republic puts philosophers in charge of everything, effectively by divine command, because he got so fed up with politicians screwing everything up, which there's a lot of problems with Republic, but that's one of the things that I think is really interesting.
I agree. And then he starts off by talking about Plato. And it says, obviously, Plato did not invent the idea of rewards and punishments in the afterlife. He even says that he was building on previous ideas. And this makes sense. It's these philosophical ideas, it makes sense. But as he says very specifically, Plato was the most influential in leading up to what we now see in Christian tradition of the afterlife. And I don't disagree. So, and he even
I don't either. He goes into the myth of air in particular, which is one of Plato's teaching tools. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Plato, Plato loved, number one, using his mentor Socrates as a mouthpiece, and number two, he absolutely loved using dialectics and mythical stories to illustrate his points. One of my favorite is one that we actually are working on animating over on Sticks and Stonehenge. He talks about how humanity came to be and the concept of soulmates, and he talks about humans being born back to back with, like, the opposite genitals on either sides, and then he has another set of people that were born with the same, and it's how he explains, like, the incredible feeling of attraction that people can feel towards each other, and also LGBTQ, like, existence. And, like, he, a lot of people are also familiar with the allegory of the cave. Well, he had a similar story talking about the afterlife. And I think that that Ehrman actually does a really good job of explaining that. He, like, even goes out of his way to point out that Plato makes it very clear that he doesn't actually believe that this story really happened, that that even his reader will very likely think that it is a myth. And I'm trying to get down to the point where he actually starts talking about it, because for some reason my mic is like spazzing out. Give me a second. I'll mute really quick.
No, you're good. While she's discovering that and getting into the myth of air, which Plato absolutely wrote about, we really see, as Dr. Ehrman says, that Plato's view of the afterlife is unique at the time, but his view of the immortality of the soul is what he calls that, and kind of builds on up into what he mentions as like Rene Descartes, right? The dualistic idea that the body is made up of matter, but the soul is inherently immaterial. And as he says here, this is actually before his time, however, it was believed that the soul was indeed material, but of a vastly different kind of material from the realities we normally encounter through our senses. And so trying at this point, as he's talking about, is to bring the two together, right? How do we say that it's immaterial? How do we say that it's real? How do we say, how can you punish something that can't feel? So if you look at like what we spoke about last week and the weeks prior, if they are incapable of feeling these, incapable of taste, incapable of pain, incapable of pleasure, then how can there be a just reward or a quote just punishment? This is he actually says that in the writing here, and they can and now, as he says, we continue to find additional explanations as we can. If in the afterlife God allows or forces people to feel that.
Well, and Plato has a really interesting explanation for that, which Bart Ehrman gives a good analogy for. He basically states, okay, well, our bodies are made of very firm stuff. Like matter is firm stuff, but our souls are made of something that's a lot finer. And Ehrman gives this idea, okay, well, this can occur naturally to people. Like you can move your hand through the air, and even though it's made up of atoms, like it's not as dense as your hand, versus if you were to punch a wall, you'd probably break your hand. And that's not Ehrman's words. Like the idea of like, air and water is kind of what he talks to. Air and water cannot pass through your hand unless there's a hole in it, but your hand can pass through them because it's more dense. And like, so Plato thought that there was a different kind of matter that our soul was made up of, and that is what the spirit plane itself was also made up of. And this is how, the dead can feast, they can be punished, they can be on the plains, as, Virgil put it, so to speak, and they can still feel things because their soul has that capability of sensory perception because it's made of this finer stuff. Plato had some really interesting ideas of how the world worked in general. In one of his seminal works, he talked about like the 4 elements, and that's where a lot of like modern, say, Wiccans get that idea from, and they don't even realize it. It's fascinating. So in that, he goes into kind of this description of like how souls that are dirtied, so to speak, by like shitty behavior, particularly things like mistreating guests, things like harming your parents, murders go all the way to Tartarus and kind of stay there. Which Tartarus, for those who aren't familiar, who haven't caught previous episodes, Tartarus is where Zeus threw the Titans for eternal punishment. It's a big, deep, dark pit. Plato reconstructs Tartarus not just as a big, deep, dark pit, but also as a place of punishment for the dead, where the worst of the worst are locked forever, and areas around it are where people who are not so bad, but are still kind of bad, get their sins sort of tortured away, so that they could be purified and be reborn.
Yeah. And I like how, while he's saying this, he says, how he knows. He actually goes on, he says, this is what we are told. All right. And this, or no, that's actually, I'm sorry, it's actually Socrates that says that. This is what we are told. This is what we are told happens.
Socrates as Plato's mouthpiece.
Yeah. There's some fun, interesting, conversations to be had with, Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. And
Well, because they like to use each other as mouthpieces, but Plato has Socrates as his mouthpiece for a good chunk of his dialectics. So when it says Socrates says this, it's Plato writing as Socrates, basically LARPing him. So if you want to read the quote from Republic there, since we're talking about, this is all the myth of air, by the way. There's this idea that this person named Air went to the afterlife and saw it and was reborn remembering it so that he could teach people. And again, Plato himself does not believe that this literally happened. Like Bart Ehrman goes out of his way to point that out on page 68 of like the ebook copy that we have. So like he uses it to illustrate kind of what a virtuous life looks like. But the quote here from Socrates is, "And so, if we are guided by me, we shall believe that the soul is immortal and capable of enduring all extremes of good and evil, and so we shall ever hold to the upward way and pursue righteousness with wisdom always and ever. And thus, both here and in that journey of 1,000 years, whereof I have told you, we shall fare well." The reference here is to this idea that every 1,000 years, there are two holes in the afterlife. One of them goes down to the place of punishment, and that's where all the dirty souls go. Again, apart from the worst ones, which just stay in Tartarus, they're not allowed out. And there's this upper hole where all of the good souls go, and all the good souls get to like party and have snacks and be awesome and happy for eternity. And or for the 1,000 years, and all of the shitty people get to go down into the lower hole, and they get basically creatively tortured. It's not overly descriptive in Ehrman's description, but he does talk about a few of the punishments. And after 1,000 years, those that are not the absolute worst of the worst get together, and they get to draw lots and choose how to reincarnate. So they can reincarnate potentially as animals, or as rich people, which they don't realize is going to cause them punishment, or as like wise people and philosophers, which will get them rewarded. You know, haha, Plato kind of rubbing himself off there a little bit. And, you know, there are some people that had such terrible lives, you know, think like victims and people who just had the worst lot of it, who were like, you know what, screw humanity. I want to come back as an animal. And so they go to the river Leith, which he doesn't name here, but that is the river that he's referencing. And they drink of the water of forgetfulness, and they go back into the world. And that was Plato's conceptualization. But like Ehrman goes on to point out that not only did he not literally believe that this happened, apart from the fact that he thought that there was some system of punishments and rewards at the end, but also that he was trying to use the story as a illustration for how to live in the current day, that trying to strive for wisdom and virtue ultimately will lead to happiness in this life and the next, and trying to striving for extreme pleasures and shitty behavior will lead to just absolutely terrible outcomes.
Yeah, and this is in the 4th century BCE. We still haven't figured it out in the 21st century altogether. So, I appreciate, by the way, Plato trying with that. I definitely do. And by the way, Dr. Dino, it's great to see you. Apologies for not giving the shout out in the chat, apparently. I love that he goes into that, the river of forgetfulness with Air, obviously. So Air was that one person that one being that either didn't have to or was skipped over, didn't actually go through the river of forgetfulness, and so was able to bring all these memories back and to say, this is what all of this is. This is like the two holes with the dirty and the clean souls and all these things. And actually being able to explain the reasoning why this is important. And again, Plato is very, very serious with he's very, very, very clear that this isn't this place where we're talking about the myth of air is not real as far as we know, but the things that we do now matter. And I really like how he puts that. And of course he leads into the underworld with Aristophanes, which I know is one of your favorite things too.
I love the frogs.
Because some people are just straight up and down serious about it. And one of those.
Kind of. So this is a comedy, but comedy meant a little something different in ancient Greece. Like there's humor in it, but there's also a lot more seriousness. Like the Greeks understood the kind of balance between the very heavy and the comedic. Something that I think modern horror fiction, like really good horror fiction, actually does very, very well. And so Greek comedies often looked a lot more like that. We would call some of them tragedies.
Yes.
But Aristophanes was commenting on a lot of modern events when he wrote it. Bart Ehrman talks a little bit about The Frogs, which is the play that we're talking about here. There was war going on at the time. I believe he said it's the Peloponnesian War. And so it was the tail end of it. And so they were talking about they needed leadership and they needed advice. So Aristophanes wrote this play about Dionysos, the god, yes, that god, and his slave Xanthias descending into the underworld to bring some dramatists back up, because, you know, playwrights and dramatists tend to have the same high opinions of themselves that philosophers do, which means that they insert their own people as very, very important. This quite often happens. So we get this idea of, okay, well, here is how you get in, and here's a brief description of what you can expect. And there's a very kind of funny, if you kind of catch the drift, the Great Muck Marsh and the Eternal River of Dung are some things that they need to cross. There are people that are going to be milling about that are being punished for breaking Xenia, which is wronging a guest. They consider it to be an incredibly unforgivable sin. Xenia is basically a compact that the gods have with humans, that a Greek from any city-state is, if they are harboring a guest, they are to treat them almost above their own family, and the guest is to do the same in kind until that guest violates that principle. So, like, it's this extreme hospitality that we don't see a version of in the modern day. It'd be kind of comparable to Southern hospitality if it were, you know, still the thing that it's reputed to be. But it was a serious deal. In fact, we talked a little bit about the Iliad and the Odyssey. Polyphemus violated Xenia by eating Odysseus's men, and part of the reason he got so punished, like by Odysseus and such, was because of that. There are numerous stories throughout that of violating Xenia and the punishments for it. So it's all through the Greek myths that this is a major problem.
Oh yeah, I like that I like they're going to see Heracles though, and I like that they use Heracles because Rome, and talking about the one, like Heracles had offended them by, you remember he stole Cerberus. And,
yeah, he offended Hades and Persephone specifically.
Yes. And he said, "You will be chased by the prowling hounds of hell, and the 100-headed viper will tear your guts, and the Tartesian lamprey shall devour your lungs, and the Tithrasian," if I got this wrong, Gorgons, who, by the way, not just from, you know, the 42, messed that one up. I don't know, the Hitchhiker's Guide. Say again.
Vogons?
There, yeah. Gorgons, Vogons, same thing. Can have your kidneys. Just, man.
That is a very specific threat.
To Heracles, too, the son of a god. Or the son of the god, right?
Well, to the son of his brother.
Oh, yeah. And it says, and he goes and he says, a variety of creative and horrifying torments awaited those on the wrong side of divine justice. And if you remember in the introduction, really, to this book, you know, Dr. Ehrman mentions the Apocalypse of Peter, which, if you have not read, not just the introduction to this book, but the Apocalypse of Peter, I recommend it, because you'll figure out, if you're like me and going to be on the quote unquote wrong side of divine justice, you'll know what's going to happen. And I actually don't know mine yet. Honestly, I haven't figured it out. Like, what's my number one sin? And that's how it's figured out. I don't know. Like, they have, like, you know, the good place.
Mine is very clearly blasphemy.
Yeah, maybe that's what mine is. I don't know if they have like good place tabulations though. So I
mine's
guess
either blasphemy or quote adultery because I'm married and in a consensual relationship with another man.
Does that count?
Well, I mean, it does to Christians because they think that marriage is some kind of sacred compact that magically makes it so you can't be with anybody else.
I mean, unless they're Christians that are like, polygamy is cool. Like, God sanctioned polygamy, which is what I mentioned.
But the only person who can be polygamous is the man. I'm not allowed to have multiple men. He can just have multiple women. Remember, there's a dual standard that God's got there. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah. No, yeah, no, absolutely. Which is kind of funny because when I looked that up, I was trying to find in the this is a slight deviation. When I looked that up, when I was trying to find a graphic for that part of our video that we released on Sunday, the first like 3 or 4 were women with 2 men. So I don't know.
Dr. Dino asks if we can just put all the sins on a dartboard and throw a dart at one of them and pick that one.
There are some that you need to go and read. You don't want those because there are worse than others type stuff. There are some that like I don't know if you want to like go and run and jump off a cliff and then run back up and do it again for all of eternity. It seems like that would just get boring after a while because nothing's going to happen. Unless it removes your memory every time, which they don't explain. Like they don't actually go into it. But there are some that are really, really fucking horrific, man. But he does talk about the place of blessing, and then it's great.
Yeah, plantations of myrtle and happy bands of revelers, men and women tripping around and clapping their hands. When he has this really pretty quote that he puts up here too. When Dionysos and Xanthias arrived at the place of blessing, they do indeed find a group of initiates singing their joy. So he talks about how the initiation into one of the mystery cults, which those were in full swing at the time of writing this play as well, how they get their own special blessing place. And it's only because they were initiated into a mystery cult and had a special relationship with a god or goddess because of it. They say, let us hasten to the meadow where the roses are so sweet and the little flowers grow in profusion at our feet. With the blessed fates to lead us, we laugh and sing and play and dance the choral dances in our traditional way. Oh, to us alone is given when our earthly days are done to gaze upon the splendor of a never-setting sun. For we saw the holy mysteries and heard the gods' behest and were mindful of our duty both to kinsperson and to guests.
It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. The poetry is phenomenal. Yeah, you don't want to go to the muck marsh, right? You want to go into the good place type stuff. And just, it's gorgeous. Oh, to us alone is given. This is the idea again, as you get into more of the given and it's not as many people, that kind of stuff. That's the narrow is the road that leads to heaven and to righteousness. And of course, these ecstasies, as Ehrman says, are reserved not for those who focus on philosophy and the good of the soul, rather than the pleasures of the body, as in Plato, but for those who have been initiated, as you mentioned, into the mystery religion.
And mystery religions were fairly common at that point. There were a number of them. The cult of Dionysos, funnily enough, was one of them, which is part of the reason I think that Aristophanes referred to mystery cults. Because the mystery cult of Dionysos, basically, Dionysos has a really interesting history. If you guys want more resources on that, I'll try to get a link over to Nathaniel at the end of the stream or to Susan to add to the description. But Overly Sarcastic Productions actually did a really good overview of the history of Dionysos. He was a very threatening, kind of scary god to the Athenian establishment in particular early on in his history. And he started kind of building all of these mystery religions that were kind of violent. I've talked before about how one of the rites that they would do is they would get drunk off of unmixed wine, which means wine that hasn't been diluted with any alcohol, with any water. And then they would tear a bull apart with their teeth and eat it raw as an ecstasy to their god. That was one of the rites that we know about. There were a number of mystery cults to a number of different gods, but the Dionysian one was particularly taboo, and so that was kind of a middle finger from Aristophanes. He was probably a member of one of those cults because they were barred by the Athenian establishment.
Yeah. It is, and certainly I'll put a link to that in the description there. Overly Sarcastic, by the way, if you are not already subscribed to them or you don't know who they are, do recommend. They are some of the best, some of the best content that I've seen with these things that would be considered like more fringe. People have more of like a fringe knowledge of, especially some of the, getting into. I saw some of their stuff getting into like Raw and
Aphrodite, like the two Aphrodites, like she did a really good job on that too.
Yes, just it's amazing stuff, and so we'll put a link to that in the description as soon as we can, get kind of the right ones and stuff, and then of course the next part of this, as we get fairly close to the end, is called a not so true story, and appreciate that this is where we start getting into the satirist Lucian of Samosata.
I love just how firmly Lucian has his tongue planted in his cheek through the quotes in this particular section. Like, it is just brilliant, and I laughed so hard reading it.
Yes.
Anyway, I will let you take this one.
Yeah. So Lucian is one of those guys that he reminds me a lot of Celsus. You'll hear about Celsus if you ever hear me speaking about some of the Greeks who were not fans of Christianity in the early days. But Lucian, much like Celsus, quote, delights in showing the afterlife torments of the very wealthy and the very powerful. So if you are one of those who are trying to, break down the strict or the runaway capitalism in the United States, you just can't seem to do it. Guess what? Lucian has a story for you, and you're going to like it, because he actually says one of them is actually entitled A True Story. So, cool. We'll just take it like, the movie Fargo. It's true. And he actually says, I've told all sorts of lies with an absolutely straight face, and says the one and only truth you'll hear from me is that I am lying by frankly admitting that there isn't a word of truth in what I say. I feel I'm avoiding the possibility of attack from any quarter. And it is great. He's a lot like the later Marco Polo, who gave fanciful stories of his traveling around. Sometimes he went to Richard Carrier's favorite place in outer space, and said, obviously his idea, Lucian's idea of outer space, was not what we have today. But he actually, if I remember correctly, now you can tell me if I'm wrong, but he actually satirized like Herodotus, right?
Yeah, Ehrman references this, but he satirized Herodotus in particular for his travel dialogues, which were supposed to be actual accounts of things that Herodotus did.
Oh yeah, because he says, I'm writing about things I never saw nor heard of from another soul, things that don't exist and couldn't possibly exist. So all readers beware. Don't believe any of it. Love that.
I laughed out loud. Like I said, tongue very firmly in cheek to the point where it got stuck.
Then he talks about going across straight to Gibraltar. And then they do the thing that, what's his name? Icarus tried to do, except they didn't have to do it with wings and glue. That rhymes. And they took their ship out and got caught up in a whirlwind and went, of all places, to the moon. And by the way, there are moon people on the moon, but they're also fighting against sun people. So
guys, because this is a totally true story, like those people who said we faked the moon landing, you heard it here. It's true, guys. It's true.
Yes.
There are moon people there, and they would have seen them. Okay, they would have been on the footage.
Yep. And then they come back to Earth somehow. There's no explanation of how. And they get all like Jonah'd up and everything. They get swallowed by a whale. I appreciate Lucian referencing that it is a whale and not a fish, which is, of course, what equates to 150 miles in length. It's a rather large whale. I'm guessing it was like eating stuff from the behemoth. which for whatever reason is not mentioned in any of these books. Whatever, do recommend reading up on that. And then whenever they go on adventures while they are inside of this whale, which apparently, it has other people who were swallowed by the whale inside of them, which makes sense because it's 150 miles. I mean, at that point. And once they are free of the whale, they actually go into the afterlife. And they pass by 5 enormous islands, he says, with huge flames spurting from their summits. Easy to just call them volcanoes, but Lucien needed to be that, that type of orator, I guess, or if you will, the type of prose that he would write. And he doesn't actually get into the amount of torture. And the ship, Ehrman writes, the ship comes to a low, flat island that wafts scents of perfume and is filled with harbors, crystal clear rivers, so there's no pollution. Thank you, America. Meadows, woods filled with songbirds, sweet blowing breezes, and people at a banquet with music and singing. And this, of course, is known as the Isle of the Blessed. And they get to stay there apparently forever, which is great because they're blessed. Doesn't ever go into why they're blessed, right? And then,
I mean, why would you? They just are.
Yeah, they're good men. Always men, by the way, too. And then there are always men that go and do this, but there's always women there, which I don't never understood that. But and then
they must have been the property of the good men.
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair. And then you can see the correlation with what Lucien writes about the city, and because Ehrman says if you have read Revelation 21 with the New Jerusalem, you get to see the city is made of gold and surrounded by walls of emerald, 7 gates. So you have these scrolls, right? Its foundation are streets made of ivory. There are temples to the gods made of beryl, and inside each is an altar of amethyst. Around the city flows a river of myrrh, 200 feet wide and deep enough to swim in. And this is what he says.
For those who don't know, by the way, myrrh is a resin that comes out of trees. So you would have a very hard time swimming in it if you tried.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. And he says, they are disembodied. They are without flesh or substance. They have a discernible outline. This is of the greats that live in the city, not just regulars, right? They have a discernible outline and form, but no more than this. In spite of having no body, they stand and move, think and talk. In short, it is as if their naked souls were walking about clad in the semblance of their bodies. Without testing them by touch, you would never know you weren't looking at actual bodies. They are like shadows, but shadows that stand erect and have color. They never grow old, but remain the age they were when they arrive. This is the later on Apocalypse of John, which is now, of course, most folks know is the book of Revelation. And this is a better book, in my opinion. And it's great the way that Dr. Ehrman just kind of goes in and actually says, obviously, this is meant to be humorous. But the very interesting part of it is the ecstasies are very, very physical. Precisely the opposite of what Plato would say. And so even at the same time, what do you have? You have these differences of opinion, differences of philosophy regarding the afterlife and what it was like with your justice, with your rewards and stuff. And so I really appreciate how he tied that back to them.
Yeah, and, again, like Lucien very clearly was trying to make up this fanciful tale. It's just very entertaining fiction.
Oh, yeah.
But it's interesting also, though, how he actually appropriates the Homeric Elysian field for his story. Because we talked about the Elysian fields in our last discussion on Heracles, on how, hey, look, it's him again. He was given this special place that's kind of this gorgeous meadow where he gets to party all the time because he's half god and half mortal. So he can't quite go into Hades, but he can't quite go to Olympus either. So he kind of has half of his spirit that gets to be awesome, and the other half gets to hang out with his wife who is mortal and gets to life sucks for him, or afterlife does.
Yeah, because there's no end to it, right? And that's where we get the idea that that we have the immortality of the afterlife, right? And then of course, and not everybody was on board with this either. Epicurus being one of them, right?
Yeah, Epicurus was notably a skeptic. I talked about him a little bit last week when we were talking about the different views of the afterlife outside of Homer. But Epicurus was basically we've got no proof that there's actually any substance to us. He formulated the ideas of atoms long before we had any way to figure out what they were. His ideas of what they were are obviously a bit different than our current modern physics understanding, but he thought that all of life was made up by these tiny little balls that basically came together to form the different stuffs. And so he said, effectively, there's nothing that could possibly bind a soul together. So that soul's just going to dissipate once it leaves the body. And he compared it to if you lose a hand or an arm, that thing can't feel anymore and you can't feel it. So why would you think that your soul would be able to feel stuff? Why would there be rewards? Why would there be punishments? How could there be an afterlife if this soul is material? So he was a pretty vocal critic of Plato and his ideas of the afterlife.
Yeah, those damn skeptics, but having that type of ability to imagine these things, which later on became some sort of reality for us in the 3rd and 4th centuries, right? It is phenomenal. And that gives, I think, now not every skeptic is able to do these things, but it gives the idea of our ability to imagine these things that we don't currently understand, but giving them some type, at least trying to give them some type of actual naturalistic type of understanding. And Epicurus really does that. And of course, what's funny is he says Epicurus has had a completely undeserved reputation as a hedonist, interested only in promoting physical pleasure. But that apparently is a mischaracterization.
Yeah, and I mentioned that a little bit last week too. Epicurus's whole big thing was that moderation is the most important thing ever. He shares some ideas with a few later philosophers that on my channel I'm going to be talking about fairly soon when I launch it. So guys, stay tuned for that if you're not following my Twitter already. But Epicurus very much thought that extreme deprivation caused misery for obvious reasons. Like if you're starving, you're probably in a lot of pain. If you're thirsty, then it's uncomfortable. If you've been, holding in the call to nature for a little too long, we all know that pain.
Yeah.
But extreme excesses also cause problems. Like if anybody's ever been blackout drunk and woke up the next day, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So, extreme pleasure brings the body to ruin and the mind, and extreme pain does too. So what's good? It's somewhere in the middle. So, he promoted the idea of good food, good drink, but not too much of either, good conversation, intellectual stimulation, but not obsession, and, cultivating of one's character, but not to the exclusion of one's pleasure. So unlike Aristotle, who is everything is perfectly in the middle and, only great people have enough pride to sacrifice themselves for the greater good or to do great things. With Epicurus is well, most people aren't going to want to do great things, but these simple pleasures of life ultimately are what's going to bring the vast majority of this satisfaction. Why would we all aspire to greatness?
Yep. And he also very much says there's nothing to fear in or about death. He's quoted later on in Lives of Eminent Philosophers as saying, death is nothing to us, for what has been dissolved has no sense experience, and what has no sense experience is nothing to us. This is the modern way of saying you're dead, you won't know. right?
If you don't know, you can't care.
Yeah. This is the, do you remember what it was like before you were born? That is much the same. There is nothing to fear because you can't sense it, because you won't know. If you can't sense things, there's no way to experience it. I mean, I'm trying to repeat something and to explain something that he said amazingly well. And says the summary of his views. So death, the most frightening of bad things, is nothing to us. Since we exist, death is not present. And when death is present, then we do not exist. Therefore, it is relevant neither to the living nor to the dead, since it does not affect the former, and the latter do not exist. And I just, oh my gosh, it's such great writing.
Yeah, the Greeks had a knack for that. And I accidentally misattributed something. The theory of atoms actually came from his student, who we're about to talk about. That's Lucretius. Lucretius got quite dogmatic and excited about this whole no death thing and started to kind of postulate what reality was like. And so that's where he came up with this whole idea of the atoms. And he came up with this idea that, okay, well, if we've got a body and we've got a soul, and the body like gets rotted and falls apart, like if the soul comes out of the body, what's keeping it together? It's just going to dissipate. Like even if there is a soul, you can't believe there's an afterlife because it's just going to dissipate.
Yeah. And that's in the 1st century BCE, right? So this would have been the type of, at least his personal Lucretian mentality right before the life of Christ, about a century or 100 years before the life of Apollonius, who definitely with his following had these ideas of afterlife and, pleasures and things like that in his following. And, but yeah, he says, and I like quoting them because it's the writing. This is the writing that people, when they think back to like, the 1st century and then even further back, I don't think people give it enough credit.
Well, and Ehrman has picked some fantastic translations in here. Like if you don't have the book already because you're like, oh, I'm listening to the book club and like that's a replacement for it, get the book anyway, if nothing else, but so you can read these amazing translations, because every single one of them, especially in the ebook, is linked back to his citations, and you can like find them and pick them up and get to read these absolutely poetic translators.
Oh yes. And there are sometimes as well, because obviously Dr. Ehrman knows Greek very well. He's translated the entire New Testament. He actually has some of his own stuff too. And also we're not giving you 30% of them. So there's so many. I mean, on this one page I'm looking at right now where I have things highlighted, I could actually even share like this one page, right, where I have this one that I'm going to read highlighted. And then there are like at least 7 more that are on here that I don't currently have highlighted. I don't know if Allie's going to mention them. So yes, definitely get the book. Talking about like this fear of death, he says, as children in bland darkness tremble and start at everything, so we in broad daylight are oppressed at times by fears as baseless as those horrors which children imagine coming upon them in the dark. And
which itself was a reference to the fear of death, which Socrates is opined on in a similar manner.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And he even says this is baseless. Right? There is no reason to fear these things. And his practical conclusion, as he calls it, a person who no longer exists cannot suffer any more than she or he suffered before coming into existence or had any sensation at all. This is what I referenced a little bit ago. So I appreciate Lucretius for taking my lead there and saying it. That was nice of him.
Yeah, he says, look back at the century before, look back at the century that passed before we were born and mark how utterly it counts to us as nothing. This is a mirror that nature holds up to us in which we may see the time that shall be after we are dead.
Yep. It's just, again, great writing. And even Cicero says, if souls are mortal, we can have no doubt that destruction in death is so complete that not even the faintest vestige of sensation is left behind. So this is not Lucretian's view was not just his alone, right? This is these ideas. You do not need to be afraid of death because you weren't afraid before you were alive. Before you can actually have this consciousness you have right now, and this is again the 1st century BCE, just before we switch over to this counting forward instead of backward type thing. But then, of course, as Ehrman is wont to do, he switches around and says, but what about those who were not Cicero, Lucretius, and Aristotle, and Socrates?
So
and
what
Plato.
about the great illiterate unwashed masses?
Yes, those 90%ers,
Yeah, he goes out of his way to make a point. Like, why don't we hear from them? It's because there wasn't mass education teaching them how to read. Learning how to read was something that was reserved for the elites. It was something that would happen with individual teachers. Philosophers often would actually preach like in public places rather than just in writing, and it was only some of the leaders that even learned how to write. So the great unwashed masses learned most things through oral traditions and through plays and the like.
Yep. And this is also a lot of what we get from the New Testament of the Christian Bible as well. And this is what most everything that's written in there is not first person. I would say 99% of it. And this is the reason why. Because not only in Greek, and he goes on to mention this later on, but not only in Greek, not in this chapter, in Greek culture, also Roman culture, but then you go even further into the fringes of the Roman Empire, and you find that 5% maybe can read, maybe in Greek. They're speaking in Aramaic. 5% can read in Greek. These are the elite. Even fewer can write in Greek, and even lower than that can write the type of prose that we see in the New Testament, or in some of these as well. And so the fact that we have anything from that time at all is actually rather amazing, and the fact that we have such great writings as well. And that's one thing that I was kind of hoping that would kind of get into. I haven't seen like that type of thing yet where he gets into that, but I'm
sure it'll be coming in the future, because we'll hit about a quarter of the way done with the book when we get to the end of this chapter, which we're almost there, guys. We're almost there.
Yeah, we'll be done within the hour. By the time the hour is upon us, so just a few more minutes. And he does. It's
interesting, though. He talks at length about how does one figure out what the unwashed masses thought, because they couldn't communicate it themselves.
Yep. Lost my place. Sorry, I looked down because I forgot to mute my phone. It presupposes that they knew, right? Because speaks about like Plutarch and stuff like that.
Well, he talks about how we kind of have a couple of different sources that we can look at for the great unwashed masses. There's the elites and what they thought of them, but he talked about how, well, think about the way that, rich people think of you now. Like, they're going to say some shitty stuff about the people that they think are below them, especially in a highly caste-driven society. So we kind of have to take what they have to say with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
And he talks about how Plutarch lamented the fear of eternal punishment that was so prevalent in, the common population. So that gives us an idea that at the very least, some people were very concerned about that. Some people that he was around. Yeah. The other thing that we get is we look at gravestones and grave sites. And we look at what sort of things are found in and around them. And he cautions that, we can't necessarily ascribe a ton of meaning just to the presence of something. He talks about these chutes that were present that went into underground graves that were clearly there to put some sort of sustenance there. Did they think that the souls needed it? Or was it kind of like pouring out of, your dad's favorite beer on his grave on his birthday as an act of remembrance? like they're not entirely sure. I attest that it's closer to the former because, again, I talked about Triakas and the ceremony of Triakas, and so graves like that were very clearly designed in part for that. But he also talks about how most of those headstones didn't have any sort of inscription beyond the person's name.
Yep. Yeah, very few of them even had anything like rest in peace, as he says. The said that they would have the highly formulaic, simply giving generalized phrases like the rest in peace. And then, of course, we have the interpretations from like what would they have said and what type of syntax would they use. The way that scholars don't necessarily do quite as well, but then you have folks that actually examine the actual way that people spoke, which is different. And he says lots of inscriptions say things like, the soul has fluttered away, your soul has escaped the body, air has taken their soul, and earth their body. And then of course, there are ones, the company of the blessed, or the worshipful house of Zeus, or to the immortal abode in the sky. And so we have these ideas, obviously, of what they would have believed. And of course, there are these mentions of these other, the gods and things like that. And so that is, that's pretty much what we get. But even then, what we see is there's no mention of hell, right?
Which is pretty typical for a modern day, right? Like, even if you really didn't like your dad, you're probably not going to stand up there and be like, motherfucker, I hope you're burning.
Yeah, I don't hope anybody goes to hell, honestly. Especially like the way that we would view hell in the modern Christianized version anyways.
But I'm saying, like, at a funeral or something, even if you had a problem with a relative, there's this idea of presenting them, even if you can't say anything overtly nice, at the very least as neutrally as possible, because there's this idea of disrespecting the dead. And I would say that headstones in ancient times probably would have been similar.
Oh, yeah. And he even says, who knows who liked, who knows that the attitude that somebody had toward this person. But it says, if you want to know who I am, the answer is ashes and burnt embers. And it's this would have been something that this person said when they were alive. Put this on, my epitaph, right? And we get that sometimes now as well. What do we actually know about these people that has not already been written down in the age of information, in the age of ability to write and read in multiple, innumerable at this point number of languages. But we see this was said by this person. And then another one, we are nothing. See, reader, how quickly we mortals return from nothing to nothing. This is the ashes to ashes, dust to dust type stuff, right? That we now say. And welcome in Luis there as well. As Dr. Dino says, hell is me waiting in line to the bathroom. Man, imagine what it was like before we had like bathrooms like we do now, right?
Well, and he mentions these two quotes specifically as a number of people who very clearly sided with Epicurus, that there ain't nothing after death, and I want people to know that that's what I think. Like, these are very passionate people who wanted people absolutely to know that they didn't believe they were going anywhere. They said, and one of the most fullest and most interesting of such inscriptions makes a rather emphatic denial of any life to come addressed to anyone walking by the tomb. And clearly this person was rich if they could afford this long of an epitaph. Because this is carved in stone, guys. Remember this.
Yeah. It's there forever. Well, there for as ever as, one could.
As ever as erosion allows.
Yes.
Wayfarer, do not pass by my epitaph, but stand and listen, and then, when you have learned the truth, proceed. There is no boat in Hades, no ferryman Charon, no Icus, keepers of the keys, nor any dog named Kerberos. All of us who have died and gone below are bones and ashes. There is nothing else. What I have told you is true. Now withdraw, Wayfarer, so you will not think that, even though dead, I talk too much.
Yeah. That's mine right there. And then at the end of this chapter, he quotes the one that he finds the most amusing, but also moving. And apparently it is the 7-letter Latin abbreviation that really would have been RIP. I'm not going to pretend that I can pronounce this Latin because I have not attempted. But this would have been something that would have been promoted by Epicurus, Lucretius. And it says, I was not, I was, I am not, I care not. And that is the end of this chapter. Next week, we're getting into chapter 5, which is death after death in the Hebrew Bible. Finally, something that I know about. I'm very excited.
Hey, you know what? You got to learn some stuff, all right? I actually got to help teach a few things and talk about like my own faith a little bit, because like this view of the afterlife, when I've talked about pagan and atheist sort of connection, and like us working together, this idea of the afterlife depending on belief is kind of unique to Christianity and to Judaism a little bit. Because later on in Jewish history, there was an idea of rewards and punishments that comes in. But as we're about to learn in the next chapter, a little less so, or like early on. And it's one of those differentiations between pagans and Christians that is really important to point out. Like, okay, if you're a shitty person, regardless of whether you believed in the gods or not, you're still going to be dealing with certain things, right? Like, it's not this, you didn't worship this particular person, so you're screwed. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Now, this was actually my favorite chapter because it was the one that I knew the least about so far. And because there was in my opinion, the best poetry so far, or the best prose so far, has been in this chapter. And I have, again, this is, whenever I find it most intriguing when I learn more, not when I go through things that I already know. And so this for me was a lot of fun. I know that next week is going to be interesting.
You're going to learn me some stuff.
It's going to be interesting for me. Now, mind you, I already hold and have held for a very long time to the position that this book does as well. So once we get into the Jesus thing, which that's the thing, people are probably wondering, like, hold on a second, there's a Jesus here somewhere. Yeah, there is.
Yeah, we're going to get there. Like, we're a quarter of the way through the book. But, like, the fact that we went this in-depth, I think, because, again, we're sort of closing a phase of the book, as it were. So that's why this conclusion is going on so long. Going into all of the history of the ancient afterlives, going into everything from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Homeric afterlife to the later philosophers, it gives us this sort of guided tour of the evolution of belief and thought on the subject. And I think that that's something that's missing in a lot of discourse when we're talking about the afterlife. There's this sort of de facto assumption that this Christian view is one that's persisted through history, and that's simply not true.
Yeah, that is what I like about that beginning of that book, where he begins to talk about the apocalypse of Peter and then goes into, this is actually what was believed. And there's a few things, obviously, like Agamemnon Agamemnon he didn't get into and whatnot, that I was kind of hoping he would, but and now we're switching over next week into the Hebrew stuff and actually getting into leading up to the Jesus stuff. And we are certainly excited for everybody that was here today to come back next week as well. We try to keep them below an hour as much as we can. Next week's going to be fun for me to try to do that. I should say, though, while we were chatting here, I received an email. Tapioca Weasel is now a patron of Divine Disbelief.
Hey, yay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if it's our first one.
Second.
Thank you. I don't keep up with these, quite obviously. But thank you so much for that. We are not in this to make money, obviously, but more to provide entertaining content that is also educational.
But money does help with doing things like improving your setup and helping pay for costs, because, Adobe Suite ain't cheap.
No, yeah. Oh, my gosh. It is not. Neither is Envato, which is where we get a lot of our stock stuff. So, but Ali, again, this was a lot of fun. Next week, Susan should be back. Would the next episode be on Wednesday? Yes, we are. No, Tuesday, right? Tuesdays.
We normally do it Tuesdays at 7:30. Unfortunately, because of personal stuff that I was dealing with yesterday and going into today, one of my roommate is currently in the hospital. I was taking care of him through part of yesterday. He told me he didn't want me to, and then I spent most of the day doing that. So that's why part of the reason why like today's episode ended up today. But going forward, we've been doing the episodes on Tuesdays at 7:30 EST or 7:30 PST, 10:30 EST. That time may move to earlier if we find that the majority of our audience prefers an earlier time. But for right now, that's the time that we've been doing it.
Yep. And on Wednesdays, Susan and I have our actual Divine Disbelief live stream where we go into secular news and opinion as well as deep dives. Susan is, pardon me, or has been working on an amazing deep dive for this week. It will be by itself. So you'll see it will release by itself, and it will be in the deep dive episode folder. I don't know what those are called on YouTube. I don't know what they're called.
They're called playlists.
Playlist. Thank you. I don't know. Look, I don't know how to get around on Discord with names either. There's servers and then channels.
Well, another friend of both of our channels, by the way, when I eventually launch mine, is if you guys are looking for something to do after this, ProLib is actually doing, Progressive Liberal is doing his 1,000 subscriber special, and he's going to be talking a little bit about David Silverman, a little bit about his plans going forward. So if you guys are looking for something to do after this, he's going to start streaming in about 15 minutes.
Silverman, huh?
Yeah, they got into a Twitter fight recently.
Good. I ignore Silverman as much as I can.
Yeah, Silverman said some racist stuff, and ProLib had a bit to say about it. So he's going to be talking a little bit about that. But like I said, it's his big 1,000 subscriber special, which congratulations to him for hitting 1,000 subs. Yes. Like, he can actually apply for monetization and stuff now. Not that it's ever really been about that for him either. He's been a great friend to both of us. Please go check him out if you haven't already, and you enjoy like deep dives on politics. He actually has a background in political science, so like he's really informed on stuff and can go way further into things than most people do. Yep,
absolutely. So definitely go and do that. Looks like also the atheist community of Austin is talking about philosophy this evening. So if you're interested in philosophy as well, they have that going on. I really like how much stuff that there actually is. So much the diversity, at least we're moving toward the actual diversity, but amongst things that we can talk about and learn about from one another. So we appreciate you coming on and learning about these histories of heaven and hell. And somebody, if you wouldn't mind, if you are a mod, to send the link to Dr. Dino for Progressive Liberal. And make sure you go. And Gideon is in the chat. Hey, Gideon, good to see you. But definitely go and do that. We will see you folks. We will have our premiere, if all goes well, for episode 2 of errors in
biblical.
Yeah. It sounds better when you look at it and hear Susan say it than me, because she made it up, and it's awesome. But there you go. There is Susan's. The link is in the chat. But that'll be Sunday, and it's going to be a premiere at 12 noon Pacific time. So I don't know what time that is for you where you are, but to do the math and you'll figure it out. So I think that's it for us today. We have intro and outro music, but I didn't pay for StreamYard Pro, or upgrade, whatever it is. So we don't have any. So we're just going to leave like this. Ellie, thank you so much. It's last errors video. Thank you. Thanks again, Ellie. This has been. I really like these. So.
Well, and thank you so much for, partnering up with me to do this, and for continuing to do this even after my partnership with Nox broke up. Like, this is something that I'm really enjoying. And as I've said 1,500 times at the end of these, it's great to have the community come together over something that isn't drama. So let's keep coming together over learning.
Yep, absolutely. And we'll see you folks Sunday. See you later.